Hi everybody, and welcome back to my Intro to Quantitative Research for Qualitative Researchers course. Today we're going to tackle a bit of a different topic here. We're going to get a little bit outside the programming, a little bit outside the math, and we're going to go to the foundations of what research really is. For some of you this may be redundant, but I think a lot of you will benefit from a refresher here. So, what is research? How do we conduct it? And most specifically, what is a research question? Whether you're doing professional research for a company or just someone who likes to explore new things, starting with a good research question is important and can really set you on a good path and help you out. It's kind of weird defining what a research question is other than a question you research. But I think the best way to describe it is that a research question is a clear, focused, and concise question that guides a research study. It defines the scope of the study, it helps identify the research objectives, and can determine the methodology that you use. Think about if you were trying to learn more about history. Where would you start? Well, Googling history would give you billions of results and wouldn't really teach you much. Take a look here at what happened after I just searched for history. I guess I could use this to go watch the History Channel and watch episodes of American Pickers, Pawn Stars, Ancient Aliens, but the other top hits are even less relevant to what I mean when I say I want to learn history. Maybe I can narrow it down to American history to help Google narrow it down a bit. Okay, the interns gave me American history, and this helped a lot, but also gave me 2 sentences of the time from 15,000 BC to the late 15th century, and then by the end of the second paragraph, it's already through the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, Louisiana Purchase. This feels very much like a bad version of my 11th grade history class, not what I'm looking for. But okay, we see something here. Let's narrow it down again to the Louisiana Purchase. That gives me some more focused hits, including a description from the National Historian's Office. This is a nice description of what the Louisiana Purchase was and a brief history of it, but I wouldn't really say I've learned a lot about history yet. There's something at the end here where President Jefferson is trying to learn about whether the Louisiana Purchase was constitutional in the principle of implied powers. That maybe leads some interesting questions about how we decided whether the Louisiana Purchase was constitutional and how that relates to implied powers of the federal government. Something like, why was the Louisiana Purchase constitutional and how does that affect the powers of the federal government? My interns went ahead and Googled this for me, and you'll see they got a nice AI summary above, some nicely focused hits that give you specific information about this question, but are broad enough that you'll still be reading for hours, days, weeks, time will pass, you'll still be trying to figure it out. When you learn about this, you will have learned something significant about history and will be a smarter person because of it, but it'll take forever and I'm not sure really how specific that's going to be. So let's take one step narrower than this just to see what happens. For example, what year was the Louisiana Purchase? Okay, Google just pops up a box saying 1803 and then provides a bunch of sources saying the same thing but with more words. Okay, how about how many acres were in the Louisiana Purchase? Wow, Google tells you there's 530 million acres and again gives you a bunch more wordy sources saying the same thing. Good information, I suppose, but would you think someone who knew that the Louisiana Purchase was in 1803 and was 530 million acres and no other info was knowledgeable about history? I personally wouldn't. The point of this whole digression here is to talk about sort of what a research question is, what the scope is, how do you want to learn, what's going on here. The idea is that we're trying to learn something, we're trying to share some maybe knowledge about a topic, become knowledgeable, become smarter, have something to share. You can go from the highest possible altitude of sort of what is history, well that's way too much. Was American history still, too broad? What is Louisiana Purchase? Okay, maybe. We're really getting into sort of these kind of interesting questions maybe around the idea of was the Louisiana Purchase constitutional and what does that mean for the Constitution? That's maybe sort of the sweet spot here. And then you get to sort of what year was it? How many acres were in Louisiana at the time? Too narrow. The whole point is to find that almost donut hole, I think, of where is the interesting idea? How are we going to do it? What are we going to do? A good research question lives in that sweet spot in the middle where it can define the scope of your study to something manageable while giving you clear objectives and an ability to say, I've finished this when you're done. Whenever you're creating a research question, whether it's for just your own personal interest or for something you're doing at a company, this is really important to think of. So I want to get that idea out there. Maybe more relevant to me at least, is another interest I have, which is football, or what Americans call soccer. I have some videos on my channel about how to do some cool football analytics you should check out if you're interested. They're really old, they're really primitive, those back, the best principles of YouTube back in like 2015, but that's not important right now. If I wanted to learn about football, I wouldn't just Google football and hope to learn much. However, learning how can we predict the winner of a specific football match would be of great interest to gamblers, or what factors contribute to winning a football match would be of interest to managers and teams and fans alike. Who won the 2006 World Cup would be a great fact to know, but wouldn't make me knowledgeable about football. Taking another direction, 2023 has been described as the year of the woman because both Beyonce and Taylor Swift made a bunch of money touring, and the Barbie movie was a huge hit at the box office. What can we learn from the commercial power of Beyonce, Taylor Swift, and Barbie in 2023 would be a really interesting research question, especially for those in economics or entertainment, and would teach you a lot. What city was the third city on the Renaissance tour is less interesting and wouldn't teach much of anything that would be useful. This was a very quick overview with, I think, some stylized examples, but this is generally how to create a research question. And for people who are interested in just learning interesting things, this can be a powerful tool to help you refine your thinking and become more interesting to talk to at parties. But let's take a few minutes to talk about some different use cases and how potentially you can alter this approach depending on what you're trying to accomplish. So what if you're trying to build a new business or launch a new product? How can you use research to support you? What types of research questions should you ask? Well, the questions you're asking should be focused on what your customers want or how you can solve user problems. Don't be a person who builds a cool piece of tech and then expects people to pay a lot of money for it. Successful businesses help users hire their solutions to complete jobs they need to accomplish. The discipline of user research often speaks of a right problem, right solution, done right framework. What this basically means is that first you have to identify the right problem that needs solving. For this phase, you can think of things that look like, what do people need help doing? What do people like to do? What is a task people hate doing? What is something complicated that people want simplified? And then who are the people who have this problem or these problems, and how many people have this problem or these problems? Once you've done that, you have to identify what the right solution for this problem is. So what sort of help do people need? What are their current solutions? What gaps are there in the current solutions for these needs? And what is the best way to deliver these solutions? So far, we've done right problem, right solution, and now the final phase is to build. We need to learn, have we done our solution right? At this point, you can get into, is my solution the right one? Is the user experience good? Where is there friction that I can remove? How much will people pay for this solution? How many people will pay for it? How can I get more people to use my product? How can I upsell people to use the premium features of my product? It's important to note that these questions apply to sole proprietors of new businesses and to user researchers of major companies. The scale is different, the ways you'll be asking these questions will be slightly different, but the idea is exactly the same. Good products all come from user needs, and good solutions come from meeting those needs in the right way. You can do this by answering these types of questions. There are different techniques to answering all these questions. We'll go through some of those as the course goes on, but today I'm really just trying to make sure that you're asking the right questions as you get started, because that's so important to what you do going forward. I want to take a step back now and talk about the role of observation. As I was researching this video, I went back to my 5th grade class where I learned the scientific method. I remembered the first 2 steps being make observations and then ask a question. When I had my interns Google this, it found conflicting advice, with some people saying observations came first, others saying ask a question came first, so I went to the experts, ChatGPT and Copilot, and they gave me eerily similar answers, both confirming that making observations comes first. While you probably came here because you're interested in quantitative research, I do want to call out the value of qualitative observations here. It's virtually impossible to ask any questions, let alone a good one, without starting with something you observe about the world. The classic example is Isaac Newton noticing an apple falling on his head. Alexander Fleming noticed bacteria didn't grow around mold. Edward Jenner noticed people who milked cows were less likely to get smallpox. Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson noticed noise like radio static while observing the space between galaxies. All of these are observations, and all of these led to massive increases in our understanding of the world, and in many cases, great products that helped us a lot. So, when thinking about developing a research question, what do you notice? What seems interesting to you? Going back to original examples from earlier in the video, let's think how observation can guide us. Well, I observed that Beyoncé, Taylor Swift, and the Barbie movie all made a ton of money in 2023. I wonder why that is. I observe a lot of football matches every weekend. I wonder why one team beats another team. It's crucial to remember we are not neutral processors of information, and we should embrace this. Our observations should guide what we're interested in and what we think is useful and good to learn. That will guide us through the entire process, from generating hypotheses to choosing variables to model selection and data generating processes to interpreting results. All this has a qualitative element to it that relies on our observations to do correctly. We'll be coming back to this throughout the course, so keep it in the back of your mind. So now that we've talked about creating a research question, let's talk about how we can start answering them. And we start with one simple principle. Math is fun, math is easy. One of the biggest barriers to entry into quantitative methods is a belief that it's difficult. Numbers are scary, and then you have to be super technical to do them. Is this true? Well, the short answer is no. The long answer is also no, except if you're trying to do modeling at a massive, massive, massive scale where small increases in precision make a difference. Think about some of the most popular products in the world. Things like Facebook or Google, where driving a 0.01% increase in use is a massive change in behavior. It may apply to voting in countries the size of the United States, and I know my political friends will tell me it certainly does, but I'm not fully convinced it matters even at that level. For the vast majority of applications, understanding how to ask interesting questions and answer them thoughtfully and to be able to explain your results to people of varying comfort with math is more than enough. In a previous life, I taught qualitative and quantitative research methods at the university level, and even some basic machine learning principles to university students with pretty significant hesitation to do anything with numbers. My students went on to win national awards for their work, and many went on to work in research roles at Fortune 500 companies, the federal government, national nonprofits, etc. I even published a peer-reviewed article on how self-efficacy is the biggest barrier to learning and how we can overcome that. So you have to trust me when I say, if you remember nothing else, remember that math is fun, math is easy. The best way to think about quantitative methods is to just ask basic questions and start thinking about the simplest numbers you can use to answer them. Let's start with an easy one. Who is the richest person in the world? So step number one, let's operationalize our variables. Operationalizing in this context is just a fancy way of saying translating words into numbers. We have a question, who is the richest person, so we need to define what rich means and then come up with a numerical representation of that. How should we define rich? Well, it turns out Forbes has a list of the richest people on the planet. And as of this recording, it looks like Elon Musk is number 1, Larry Ellison is number 2, and Jeff Bezos is number 3. The list goes on, but that's all that actually fit into my screenshot, so that's all we're going to talk about. This might seem too easy, but let's walk through the mental processes behind the scenes we did to answer this so we can apply them to other questions. We're trying to learn who is the richest person on the planet, so we need to define what that means. While we could talk about richest of spirit, or rich with love, or rich with the number of lions you own, we probably don't mean in any of those contexts. What do we mean? It's a pretty straightforward one. If you didn't know what rich meant and you looked it up on Google, you'd see having a great deal of money or assets. So let's define the richest person as the one with the most money. Easy enough. This is called operationalizing variables. Again, it just means coming up with a definition for a concept you can use to measure something. We're going to be doing this a lot together through this video, so remember that phrase. Okay, so what we did was look up how much money people have and then rank them from highest to lowest. That will tell us who has the most money, which is how we're defining rich, and then just simply putting them in order lets us know who the richest is. This is easy and effective, and at its core is quantitative research. You've used numbers to answer a research question. That's it. Going back to the lesson about research questions and why they're important, knowing who the richest person in the world is means you've learned a piece of trivia rather than doing research. So that's maybe not what we're trying to do, but the principle for how this translates to more rigorous research isn't much more difficult than this. Because building self-efficacy is all about slightly increasing the difficulty and celebrating the wins as we get them, let's take this concept one step further and talk about the statistical concept of validity. Validity in statistical measurement refers to the extent to which a test or instrument measures what it claims to measure. It's important to be aware of this because validity is a major factor in determining the accuracy and credibility of the conclusions drawn from the data. There's multiple dimensions to validity, so let's talk about a couple of them right now. The first is construct validity. This type assesses whether something measures the concept it's intended to measure. Basically, are you doing what you're saying you're doing? A silly example might be if we're trying to measure someone's height, you wouldn't use a thermometer because that's not a measurement of height. A less silly example might be measuring how prestigious a job is by looking at the salary. While salary is probably correlated with prestige, it's not the same conceptually, so measuring it that way wouldn't give you valid results. The second type is face validity. This is a more superficial measure, assessing whether the test appears to measure what it's supposed to measure based on a subjective judgment. This is maybe the best way to start with any test of validity. I recommend thinking of ways to measure, writing them down in words, and then matching it back to the original research question you're asking. This is the best way to make sure you're thoughtful about what you're doing, so let's practice this skill by asking a question with some slightly more complex measurement involved. Which country is the best at football? We have two variables here, country and best at football. Country is a fairly well-defined concept. For international relations majors, maybe there's some controversy here, but the rest of us, we know what a country is. Especially when we're talking about which country is the best at football, we're not likely talking about edge cases here. That's easy enough. We'll find a list of countries and we have variable number 1 measured pretty concretely. Check that one off. Let's go to variable 2. Best at football is a little more difficult. Do we want to talk about best over history? Then maybe we can look at World Cup results over the time. It's the biggest international tournament in football, all countries have a chance to qualify, and it has accurate, easily available data. But what about the World Cup? Should we see which countries have won it the most? Easy enough, Wikipedia has an article about that. And my interns looked it up and found that Brazil has won the most World Cups, followed by Germany, Italy, Argentina, France, Uruguay, England, and Spain. Does this mean Brazil is the greatest footballing nation? Maybe, but let's do that exercise where we take a step back to our question, which country is best at football? Our measurements actually answer the question, which country has won the most World Cups? That's similar, but you can see that they're not necessarily equivalent. Winning the most World Cups is not the same as best at football. Try a different way of measuring it then. What if we define best at football as finished in the top 4 of the World Cup? What will we find? Well, interns found this for me, and we see the rankings are Germany, Brazil, Italy, France, Argentina, Uruguay, Netherlands, and Sweden. This is like we saw in the previous rankings with a noticeably different order and a couple of other countries listed. There's another question here. Our two measures have looked at historical data, but does that answer the question, which country is best at football? 90s kids will never forget Bill Clinton saying, it depends on what the definition of the word is. And that's true here. What do we mean by is? Do we mean in the current state, one since the beginning of international football? What do we mean? If we mean currently, then we can look at the FIFA rankings, which has a relatively complex calculation underlying them, but for simplicity, we can just use cardinal numbers if we want. Taking a look here, it's Argentina, France, Spain, England, Brazil. Not that far off from the other measures, to be honest, which is interesting because it should be largely unrelated to the number of World Cups each team has won. There's a conversation we had here about triangulating data and definitions, but that's one for another day. So which one is better? The short answer is, I don't know. The long answer is, which definition do you think aligns better with the original question? Or, returning to our concepts, which do you think has more face validity? What makes more sense to you? Best at football defined as winning the most World Cups, placing top 4 at most World Cups, or their current ranking is defined by FIFA? It's entirely up to you, and all you can do is be thoughtful about how well the definitions you use match up with the original question. Be transparent about the choices you've made, and keep refining it as you learn more. Let's do one more thing in this lesson and talk about reliability. Reliability in statistical measurement refers to the consistency and dependability of a test or instrument. It indicates how consistently a method measures something under the same conditions. If I put 3 properly calibrated thermometers outside in the same place at the same time, they should show me the same temperature. This can be especially difficult when you're talking to people who are notorious for not having concrete opinions or beliefs and can change from one minute to the next with no real reason behind it. Let's go back to that question of which country is the best at football for a minute. Let's say we asked people this question. We're going to use those survey results for our measurement. Do you think people would give the same answer consistently? Some might. Others would have a top 3 that could be roughly interchangeable and might give a different answer depending on some random factor at the moment. Taking it away from football for a minute, if I asked you, what's your favorite song? Do you necessarily have a concrete answer to that question? Or more likely, do you have a lot of songs you really enjoyed and might name any of those at a given moment depending on your mood? What if I asked you, what is your favorite food? Do you have a consistent answer you give every time for this question? Or this change based on the weather, what you had last night for dinner, how hungry you are at the moment, etc., etc. Thinking about reliability, especially on subjective measurements that involve asking people for their opinions, is important. To be clear, it doesn't mean you shouldn't ask people for their opinions. In fact, we should ask them their opinions more often than we do already on a lot of things, especially related to product decisions. But when you're doing so, make sure you create reliable measures you'd expect to see similar answers if you ask the same person the same question again. There's a few ways to do that, which you can learn more about in a course on best practices in survey development coming soon, but I wanted to introduce some of them now. Number 1, clear and unambiguous questions. Ensure that your questions are easy to understand. Avoid complex language or jargon that might confuse your respondents. Clear questions reduce the likelihood of varied interpretations, which can lead to inconsistent answers. Number 2, consistent response scales. Use consistent response scales throughout your survey. For example, if you use a 5-point Likert scale for one question, go ahead and use the same scale for all similar questions. This consistency helps respondents understand the scale better and respond more reliably. Number 3, pilot testing, also known as cognitive pre-testing. This is where you conduct a pilot test with a small group of respondents before the main survey. This helps identify any confusing or ambiguous questions and allows you to make necessary adjustments as needed. Pilot testing, talking to people about your survey, can really improve the reliability of your survey, so highly recommended whenever you're doing something larger. Number 4, training for interviewers. This is kind of a rare case, but if your survey involves interviewers, ensure they're well trained to administer the questions consistently. This includes understanding the questions thoroughly and knowing how to handle respondents' queries or issues. Number 5, avoid leading questions. Leading questions can bias respondents' answers. Ensure your questions are neutral and do not suggest a particular response. For example, instead of asking, "Don't you think this new policy is beneficial?" you should ask something like, "What is your opinion on the new policy?" Number 6, balance your question order. The order of questions can influence responses. Place questions in a logical order and avoid placing sensitive or potentially biasing questions at the beginning. This helps maintain the reliability of responses throughout the survey. Number 7, use multiple items. For complex constructs, you can use multiple items to measure the same concept. This approach, which is known as internal consistency, helps ensure that the responses are reliable. You can then use statistical measures like Cronbach's alpha to assess the reliability of the scale. That's something for a much more advanced course, but it's something you can think about as you build your survey skills. 8, regular review and update. Regularly review and update your survey questions to ensure they remain relevant and clear. Changes in language, culture, or context can affect how questions are understood and answered. By implementing these strategies, you can enhance the reliability of opinion questions in your surveys, leading to more consistent and dependable data. We've done a lot here in this video today, and I want to thank you all for staying with me. I want to take a minute to reflect on what you've learned. You've learned some basic principles on how to transform a research question into variables. You've learned how to operationalize those variables or turn variables into quantitative measurements we can use for analysis. You've learned how to examine your measures for face validity, whether they appear to measure what they're supposed to measure based on subjective judgment. You've learned how to consider reliability, or whether consistently measuring the same thing at the same time yields the same results. Most importantly, you learned that using numbers to answer questions isn't difficult, and you have a few tools now you can use to start being great at it. All that being said, I really want you to reflect on the idea that you have learned how to create a research question that guides your research practices. It will help scope what you're doing, It will help inform the reader of what they're trying to learn, and it will help inform you on what you're trying to study and what you're trying to communicate to others, or just learn for yourself. And you've learned then some basic principles on how to create variables to answer those types of research questions. This is a lot. This is a big win for everybody. Celebrate the win. Get ready for even more learning coming next. I'm very excited to keep going with this, but I'm super happy that you all joined me through this and really are thinking about not just how to do graphs and how to use fancy quantitative measures. Instead, you're really focusing on how to create a solid research agenda. So thanks everybody for joining me in how to create simple quantitative measurements for well thought out research questions. Tune in next time and we'll start doing some analyses. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Hi everybody, I'm backstage with one more note. It's an interesting thing. Since I wrote this script, I found some things on Instagram that really fit what I was talking about and were less abstract. I'm gonna ask my interns to go find them. We'll see what they can do. But I saw a really interesting post that was complaining about the complexity of music has gone down over time, and that music today is so simple. It's a familiar refrain. It's not music, but there's a quote from like Aristotle or something of people have gotten less interested over time and culture is diminishing and all these things. It's the stuff we used to complain about our parents and the boomer generation used to do. We're now talking about music in my day. It used to be so much more complex and interesting. And it was very interesting to me. They measured complexity as the number of key changes in a song. I was a music major in a different life, and I don't think the number of key changes makes a piece complex or not. We studied some truly complex pieces of classical music that don't necessarily change keys at all. And it's not sort of a particularly useful measure. I'm not sure why the author thought this was good. Presumably it was something they could measure, something they could find. But this was from like a big account. It wasn't just some random person doing this. I wouldn't spend the time talking about that. I'm thinking about even just sort of, some of the great clarinet pieces of all time, the clarinet concerto from Mozart K622, for example. And it's not necessarily the most complex piece, but it's a great piece of music that I don't believe changes keys, at least in the first couple movements. Like I think each movement has the same key. I could be wrong on that, but as I remember it, I'm almost positive number 2 doesn't, and I'd bet on number 1 as well. Number 3 I'm not as familiar with. But the whole point of this is this person started with a question of, has music gotten simpler over time? And then they measured it with a weird variable of number of key changes. And what they're actually asking is, how often does music change keys over time? That's not a question of complexity, which then I don't think translates to a measure of quality. It's a very interesting, I think, sort of real world example. It is social media, but it's a real world example, at least in my world, of using measures that don't match up, that don't fit what you're talking about. Going to that validity point of, is this a measure of what you're actually saying? Is key change the same as complexity in a song? And I just wildly don't think that's true, and it very much struck me. I wrote the script out and recorded the video, but I wanted to add this in at the end because I thought it was particularly interesting. And you see these things in the real world. It's not just me creating examples for a class or whatever. People struggle with this. And if you can do this precisely and do this well, you will be ahead of the game. It's really, I think, a great point of quantitative methods doesn't necessarily mean fancy methods. It just means strict rigor on what you're doing. It means operationalizing your variables correctly, focusing on concepts like validity and reliability. In a lot of ways, it's no different than qualitative research, but there is something to be said for people seeing numbers as more precise or whatever. And so when you're doing this, you need to be extra careful. And if you do that, you will have created excellent research regardless of any sort of aptitude at math. Things like this don't require math skill, they just require care. Taking the time to think about, do your measures match what they're supposed to do, not just here's something cool I found and now I'm going to post it on the internet. That's all I had for here. I did want to take a minute though from the lounge to just talk about something I saw in real life and relate it back to the course and try to hammer home the point one more time that these concepts, while they seem simple and they're not fancy math and they're not getting into some significant R programming, are every bit as important to your being a quantitative researcher, being a top quantitative researcher, as all the fancy math in the world, if not more important. If you can't do these, I don't care what your math looks like. You have to be able to do the basics first. Really spending the time to do this is important. And I'm glad you all watched my video. And please comment, like, subscribe. I'm very excited to hear what people think. I'm very excited to see you all learn. We're going to be at that Dr. Chad Data Viz certification in no time. Thanks, everybody.